אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
Before we get into the 5 themes that we will be discussing in the subsequent lectures, I want to say something about the general character of the Declaration of Independence. The document wasn't something that the founders had time to brood over or debate at their leisure. It was compiled over a fairly short period of time. The active period was about 3 weeks from the 3rd week of April right through to the hard deadline, which was May the 15th. That's the date that the British unilaterally determined and scheduled for the end of the mandate. Now, we owe a huge debt to Professor Yoram Shachar, who did this painstaking reconstruction of the drafting process in an 80-page article in the Tel Aviv Law Review. Not a single historian had done the work before him, and he isn't even a historian. He is a legal scholar. And Shachar was able to put the puzzle together because the heirs to some of the drafters had kept early drafts up in the attic and showed them to him. So Shachar did this yeoman's work both in these private papers, and this was even before they became a hot item. Now, that happened in 2015, when the heir of the lawyer who did the first drafts tried to sell them at an auction at a starting price of $250,000. The State of Israel blocked the sale, and the status of the documents is still in the courts. But thanks to Shachar, their contents have already been published, so we know what's in them. Now, this drafting process was hugely complicated. And as I said earlier, we're not going to do a forensic analysis of all of the different drafts. Let me just provide for you a simplified outline. Even this will sound complex to you, but I assure you that I have reduced it to the bare minimum. There were various abortive starts and outside suggestions. I won't even mention them. But it all really began on April 24th, when Felix Rosenblit, who would later become Pinchas Rosen, the first justice minister of the State of Israel, asked a 33-year-old Tel Aviv lawyer, Mordechai Beham, to try his hand at a draft. It was an assignment. So Beham went home, and he asked help from a friend, Harry Solomon Davidovich, who was a Lithuanian Jew who'd become a conservative rabbi in the United States. Now, Davidovich had a substantial library, and in it he had the text of the American Declaration of Independence. What Beham did was to simply copy parts of it in English by hand. And then he translated it into Hebrew, making a few suitable amendations along the way. And then Beham went back to Rosenblit and gave him his draft. Now, Rosenblit wasn't entirely satisfied. He gave it to his friend, a future Supreme Court Justice, Tzvi Berenson. Berenson would later claim that he wrote the Declaration himself over a period of 48 hours without the aid of a preliminary text. But now that we have the draft, we see that he clearly borrowed from Beham, and the draft then came back to Rosenblit. He still wasn't satisfied. So Beham and another jurist, Uri Adin, took another cut at it. It then went to a 5-man committee, effectively headed by Moshe Shertok. Shertok worked through the night of May the 12th, at first from scratch, but eventually he did make use of some of Rosenblit's draft. Shertok then presented this draft to the committee on May 13th. We're now the day before the Declaration. But there were disagreements. And I'll come to some of them later. So Ben-Gurion took the text home, closed himself in his office, and in perhaps 10 minutes, cut the Declaration by a quarter, and then added some crucial elements. The next day, he presented it as a fait accompli to the People's Council, where a truncated debate took place. Ben-Gurion promised that they could make amendments later, so they adopted it and rushed off to the museum. Ben-Gurion would read his text before the nation and the world, and not a word has been changed since. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a highly abbreviated and compressed account of the drafting process. The key point is that in this process, things went into the text and came out of the text as a result of the preferences of different participants in the drafting process. So Beham, the young lawyer working under the influence of a rabbi, entered the most religious elements. Berenson, who was a man of very liberal tendencies, made more room for individual rights. Chertok and Ben-Gurion were concerned with establishing legitimacy, both domestic and international. So all of these elements feature in the document, although the mix of them changed over time. Now, as I mentioned before, it's been said about the Declaration that if its drafters had argued for another week or a few days or a few hours, the document would read differently than it does. And might have read differently if Ben-Gurion had been as free to dwell on it as Thomas Jefferson was when he worked on the American Declaration of Independence. But he wasn't. While the Declaration is identified with Ben-Gurion more than anyone else, he didn't spend much time on it. He believed there should be a declaration of statehood, but he let others draft the Declaration and didn't spend much time of any waking day on its content. His prime concern, though not his exclusive one, seems to have been to assure that the Declaration said nothing that would limit Israel's war plans. Now, as I noted, he took a final cut at it the night before the Declaration and gave it his unique imprimatur. But he did it on the fly. Thus, when we read his diary entry for May 13, 1948, the day he edited the Declaration, we find that nearly all of it is devoted to war matters. At the time, the Etzion bloc, a cluster of Jewish settlements outside Jerusalem, was under siege by the Jordanian Arab Legion. Ben-Gurion is clearly preoccupied. Lives are at stake. So is the fate of Jerusalem. Only at the end of the entry of several pages does he laconically write the following. At 6 o'clock, a People's Council meeting to discuss the phrasing of the Declaration which Moshe, Chertok, prepared. In the evening, I prepared the final edition of the draft. In the early afternoon of the next day, the day of the Declaration, Ben-Gurion offered the final draft to the People's Council for its approval. And all kinds of objections were made by persons who had just seen the draft. And Ben-Gurion simply told them there wasn't time to make changes, that they could express their reservations later, but that they should accept for now the document as a package, given the time constraints. And this is how he explained it to them, and I quote him. Listen carefully. We are living in an abnormal time. First, the mandate ends today. Second, state of emergency. Third, over the last few days we couldn't bring over a significant number of members stuck in Jerusalem, despite their legitimate request. The purpose of the Declaration isn't to delve into political clarifications, and we have lots of political scores. Its purpose is anchoring the Declaration of Independence. This is its main function. I agree that the text isn't the height of perfection. It's Ben-Gurion. And there is no one among its compilers who thinks it's the height of perfection. But the purpose was to give just those things that, in our opinion, provide a basis for what we'll do today for the people of Israel, world opinion, and the United Nations. We're declaring independence, nothing more. This isn't a constitution. As for the Constitution, we will have a session on Sunday when we will deal with it. So Ben-Gurion asked them to put their reservations aside, and they agreed to do so as a matter of urgent expediency. But had they had time for general debate, certain passages might have read differently. A friend of mine recently told me he had read the Declaration together with his granddaughter, and they had dwelt on every phrase as though they were reading a portion of the Bible. Not only is there a natural inclination to do so, but there's a visual cue to do just that. When we see the Declaration, we see a parchment that looks like a Torah scroll, The calligraphic font is ktav stam, which is used in preparing Torah scrolls. Indeed, the document in Hebrew is called a Megillah. Megillah, scroll of independence is what it's called. A word also used to describe certain sacred writings. But this sacralization of the artifact doesn't really help us understand the forces that made the text. And it helps to gain perspective if we recall a few facts. First, Ben-Gurion didn't read the declaration from this scroll. He read it from 3 mimeographed pages because the text had been in flux until the last minute, and the calligrapher didn't have time to produce a final product in time for the ceremony. The signatories affixed their signatures to a piece of blank parchment temporarily attached to the mimeograph. The parchment was later stitched to a larger parchment-like paper with the calligraphic text of the whole declaration. And this is the description I read to you from the Israel State Archives, which is the custodian of the scroll. The scroll is comprised of 3 parts. The 2 upper sections are made of parchment-like paper, while the lower section, containing the signatures, is made of real parchment. The 3 parts were treated and made to look identical. End of quote. So in fact, while the paper looks identical, you can see the stitches quite clearly. There are 2 sets of them. The complete object, in fact, wasn't even ready until June. So the really proper way to read the declaration is to focus not only on the text, but on the stitches. Because they remind us that this is a contingent text, stitched together, written against a deadline in the midst of other dramatic developments. Phrases appeared and disappeared as the text evolved. Later, the text would be canonized, and its every nuance parsed as to the intent of the founders. Now, no one can deny intent. If there wasn't any, there would be no point to this lecture series. But it's important to remember when we get down to the fine resolution that any phrase we're analyzing may read exactly as it does because the authors just ran out of time. Now let me give just one example. And this one relates more to style than to substance. One of the changes that Ben-Gurion made in the text was to change the way the sentences opened in the first part. In the penultimate draft by Moshe Shertok, each sentence opened with whereas, ho'il ve, right? Whereas the Jewish people, and whereas in every generation, and whereas the mandate, and whereas the persecutions, and so on. There were 9 of them, and his version then culminated in that famous word, therefore, lefichach. We declare the state. The evening before the declaration, Ben-Gurion crossed out all of the whereases. And Shertok never quite resolved himself to this. And here he is in an interview 13 years later, and I quote him. Ben-Gurion changed the structure of the declaration, which I regret to this day. I believe that he weakened the logical sequence of the document. I had inserted the word whereas as a connecting link between each of the paragraphs, thus leading up as to a climax to the declaration of the creation of the state, which commenced with the word therefore. I was of the opinion that by beginning the declaration with the word whereas and repeating it at the head of each paragraph, a sense of close continuity would be introduced, which would keep the reader in growing suspense until the final hammer blow, therefore. Ben-Gurion did not believe that this kind of formulation was suitable for such a document, particularly in Hebrew. So he began his draft by simply citing a series of facts, one after the other. His conclusion, which also began with the word therefore, had, to my mind, no apparent connection with what had preceded it. I thought that this constituted a serious defect in the declaration, but there was no time to thrash out the matter properly, so that is how it went. End of quote. So, no time to thrash it out, so it went. Let me touch on another characteristic of the document. As Americans, many of you, you are accustomed to the spirited language of the Declaration of Independence, the American one. And when you read the Israeli Declaration, you may find it subdued by contrast. I compare the difference to that between the Star-Spangled Banner and Hatikvah. The American anthem really is a call to battle, to rally around an embattled flag. The Israeli anthem is about long-term perseverance, a hope that never flags. And whenever at some event there's a quick shift from the American to the Israeli anthem, you feel the difference. Both are moving, but in different ways. And you might feel the same thing when comparing these two documents, the American Declaration and the Israeli one, in your mind. So here, for Americans, it's important to recognize a fundamental difference between the two documents. While we call the Israeli document a Declaration of Independence, it actually has another name. The formal name of the document is the Proclamation of the State of Israel. Not independence, but statehood. Now, these may seem identical, but they're two different things. And not every state has a Declaration of Independence. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, just for starters. Most states that have declarations of independence belong to empires from which they separated or seceded, often in struggles of liberation. They declared independence from another polity. And so if you read the American Declaration of Independence, a key element is a long litany of complaints and grievances against the misrule of an overlord, followed by a call to arms. If you read the American Declaration, you'll see that the larger part of it, about 70%, is a bill of particulars concerning King George III's repeated injuries and usurpations, and his trampling on the liberties of Americans. Now, the Yishuv likewise waged a struggle against the repeated injuries and usurpations of Britain under another King George, VI. It was Britain which shut the doors of the Jewish national home to the Jews of Europe at the hour of their greatest need, which is a greater injustice than any inflicted by Britain on the American colonists. And the British decision to give up the Palestine Mandate may have been the result of a blood-stained struggle waged against them by Jews. Yet we've read the Israeli Declaration, and as you've heard, it doesn't include a single grievance against the departing imperial overlord. Why? A bill of particulars wasn't necessary for two reasons. First, to some extent, it had already been delivered. In fact, there is a precursor to the Israeli Declaration that does sound more like the American Declaration in just this respect. This is the Declaration of Political Independence, so it is called, made by the Zionist Executive Council, the highest body of the Zionist organization, on April 12th. That is, a month before the end of the mandate. In a dramatic midnight session in Tel Aviv on that date, the Zionist Executive Council declared, and I quote, its decision to establish in the country the high authority of our political independence. Immediately upon the end of the mandate, and no later than May 16th, there will come into being a Jewish provisional government. This is a month before the declaration. And it was precisely to implement this decision that the Zionist executive, in that same declaration, created the People's Administration, headed by Ben-Gurion, to implement its decision. Ben-Gurion would later claim that effectively that was the moment at which the decision was made to declare independence. Now, this declaration of political independence was written by Zalman Rubashov, later Zalman Shazar, who was became the third president of Israel. He was very famous for his rhetorical skill. Historians of the Declaration don't usually include his text in the later drafting history because it can't be shown that it was used as a base text by the later drafters. But at the same time, it did play an inspirational role. People were familiar with it. Whatever its influence, it certainly exempted the later declaration from settling open accounts with Britain. And I quote from the April Declaration of Political Independence, "If you're an Anglophone, prepare yourself for a cold shower." This is Rubashov's speech. "Behold, the days of the British mandate have ended. On May 15th, the UN will take back from the British government the trust given to it by the League of Nations 28 years ago and which it did not uphold. The denial by the British mandate of its purpose grew and became in the last 10 years the basis of Britain's policy in the East. Instead of assisting the immigration of Jews to their national home, the gates were closed before the persecuted of our people in the most tragic hour of their dispersion. Britain imposed a blockade on those who reached these shores and recruited forces from afar to condemn them to lives of danger and loss. The barren lands of our country they forfeited to the eternal desert and our dogged rivals. They chose as an ally the allies of the greatest tormentors of our people and the enemy of all humanity, the hand that locked the gates in the face of our tortured brethren, for whose salvation the national home was mandated by the entire League of Nations, opened those same gates to the vandals and invaders who entered through the crossings to prevent the implementation of the decision of the nations and to plot to finish that which Satan, that's Hitler, that's which Satan did not complete. And now, before Britain's departure, the mandatory government strikes at the foundations of our creative work and forfeits to chaos that which we built up with painstaking perseverance over generations. The land of our redemptive hope is about to become, God forbid, a trap for the remnant of Israel. Therefore, the World Zionist movement, in agreement with the entire House of Israel, is resolved upon the end of the failed mandatory government to banish foreign rule from the land of Israel so that the people will rise up and establish its independence in its homeland. Now, that sounds like a declaration of independence in the best American tradition. The British closed the gates of Palestine to the Jews. Yes, the British also closed the gates to the American colonies. The American Declaration complains that King George III, and I quote, has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. The British in Palestine have allied with our tormentors, opening the crossings to invaders. Why, the British did the same to the American colonists. The American Declaration accuses the British of, quote, endeavoring to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. End of quote, and so on and so on. Now, none of this spirit made its way into the Israeli Declaration, which doesn't include a single grievance against Britain. And one reason I submit is that Rubashov's declaration already delivered the bill of indictment. There was no need. But there's another reason, and this one may be more profound. The British didn't have to be defeated and thrown out. That struggle had ended, and they were leaving. The Israeli Declaration didn't need to rally anyone against perfidious Albion. The Jewish state in the Israeli Declaration would arise from May 15, 1948, in a void, resulting from the termination of the British mandate. There is no governing authority from which to declare independence. The Declaration doesn't even declare the state now. In the words of the Declaration, it only comes into effect from the moment of the termination of the mandate being tonight. So the Jewish state arises not in opposition to anyone, not in rebellion against anyone, but as a successor to a vacated authority. There was one last stab at putting in a condemnation of the British at the People's Council meeting on the day of the Declaration. Mayor Villeneuve of the Communist Party proposed an article denouncing the oppression of both Jews and Arabs by British colonialism. Chertok replied, and I quote him, "If we go into historical assessments and definitions, I'm afraid it will spoil the celebratory spirit of the Declaration and also its political logic at this time." So, and when someone argued that Britain's conduct since 1939 should at least be punished by not mentioning the Balfour Declaration, Ben-Gurion ruled otherwise, and I quote him, "I disagree with the proposal to erase the Balfour Declaration. It's ridiculous, and it would be understood as vindictive small-mindedness and bad form." The new Jewish state also had something going for it that the American colonies did not. When states declare independence from another polity, they usually have to build their legitimacy from scratch. Israel's declaration assumes that the legitimacy of the state is a settled matter as a result of a UN General Assembly resolution, that of November 1947. It's the UN, says the Israeli Declaration, that, and I quote, passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. The General Assembly, this is the declaration, required the inhabitants of Eretz Israel to take such steps as were necessary on their part for implementation of that resolution. So, the Yishuv, in establishing the state, is simply fulfilling a requirement of the international community. All this reminds us that the circumstances of Israel's birth are an anomaly. The author, Arthur Kessler, pointed to this in his 1949 book, Promise and Fulfillment, and I want to quote him. Virtually all sovereign states have come into being through some form of violent and, at the time, lawless upheaval, which after a while became accepted as a fait accompli. Nowhere in history, whether in the time of the migrations, the Norman Conquest, the Dutch War of Independence, or the forcible colonization of America, do we find an example of a state being peacefully born by international agreement. In this respect, Israel is a freak. It is a kind of Frankenstein creation, conceived on paper, blueprinted in the mandate, hatched out in the diplomatic laboratory. End of quote. Now, Kessler later writes that the implementation stage, Israel secured its independence in a violent cataclysm, like all other states. But it received its license to exist by a 2/3 majority vote of the world's other independent states in the city of New York, like no other state. And in declaring its independence, Israel could claim to be on the side of international agreement, international law. The Arabs were in rebellion against it. So the declaration doesn't include a call to arms. Instead, it includes a call to Israel's Arab neighbors for peace. Because of these circumstances, it has been argued that Israel never declared independence at all. It declared statehood. And that for this reason, the declaration itself is anemic, not a rallying cry, but a combination of self-justification and legalistic exposition. It's also a fact that it was drafted not by the nation's writers or poets, but by lawyers and politicians concerned with legalities and politics. Its purpose was to legitimate the state, not stir its citizens to action. It's one of the reasons for a contemporary expression of disappointment by one of the lawyers who worked on the drafts. This was Uri Adin, who had worked with Beham, and he thought the whole thing had been botched, and that the declaration failed to rise to the occasion. He wrote in his diary at the time, and I quote him, "It was a terrible disappointment for me. A deep depression descended on me. The ceremony in the museum before a small audience, as though it was hidden, without celebration, without an uplifting of the spirit, without inspiration of the historic hour. Such was the content of the declaration, watered down, without strong emphases, confused, lacking all daring, decisiveness, or pride. What a distance between this speech in a Zionist committee and the ringing echoes of destiny we hoped would be sounded by the declaration." Now, Eliakim Rubinstein, a former Supreme Court justice, has argued that despite this criticism, the declaration does convey a spirit of celebration. But I think there's a larger issue here. The Yishuv didn't need a call to arms. It had been in a state of preparation for battle for years. The Arab attacks that had grown in intensity after November 1947, the threats by the Arab states to invade, the knowledge that Holocaust survivors, family, were still being turned away from Palestine's shores. All of these meant that there wasn't a need to call the people to arms. In fact, the clandestine armies were already in place. All they needed now were real arms, which would begin to flow in with independence. America's declaration is strident and bold because American colonists needed to be stiffened. After all, they shared language and descent with their British overlords. They once had been loyal subjects of the same king, and now they were taking up arms against their estranged brethren. But the Jews dwelt alone, and they knew it. They didn't need to be told that they must fight, because they knew that if they didn't, they might perish. No American colonist, in the back of his mind, had anything like the Holocaust. The Declaration then has something of the character of that day in May 70 years ago. The journalist and Zionist functionary Yitzhak Ziv Av, who attended the Declaration, described it in these words only a few days later, and I will quote him. "The ceremony was very brief, slightly hurried, overly dry, and without external markings of festivity. No characteristic stimulating excitement or imagination. The ceremony began with the pounding of a gavel and without words. With nothing more than a gesture of his hand, Ben-Gurion invited us to stand for the singing of the anthem. While some might have expected to hear grand words about fire, blood, shadows of the past, an end to subjugation, and an historical occasion, these words were not voiced. Everyone kept his emotions inside. One day, we will appreciate the great modesty with which an embattled nation declared its state, its dream that had come true. Some perspective of time is needed for a person to understand that those 33 minutes changed him to the core, himself and every other Jew. But the restraint in the document, as in the ceremony, was in some ways deceiving. Golda Meir, one of the two women signers, described Chertok as very controlled and calm compared to me. But she wrote in her memoirs about Chertok, he later told me that when he wrote his name on the scroll, he felt as though he were standing on a cliff with a gale blowing up all around him and nothing to hold on to except his determination not to be blown over into the raging sea below. But none of this showed at the time. That perhaps is how best to understand the character of the Declaration. A document written in the midst of a brewing storm by a crew who hoped to craft a masterpiece, even as the winds howled about them, water was coming over the deck, and shoals loomed ahead. That concludes my second lecture. Thank you. Mr. Ben-Gurion turned to me and said in a peremptory tone, "Sign Vardi, not Rosenblum." Had I been in a more balanced frame of mind, I might have added Rosenblum in parentheses. But at that moment, I obeyed him unthinkingly. I did as he said and signed Herzl Vardi. And so it appears. And to this day, there are people who don't know who that Herzl Vardi is, whose name appears on the Scroll of Independence.